The morning sun hung low over the Pacific as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake stepped off the transport and onto the wide expanse of tarmac. The air smelled of jet fuel and salt water, the combination instantly familiar yet edged with tension. She had landed on countless military bases before, but this one carried a different weight. It wasn't her world. This was a Navy installation, home to carrier pilots, sailors, and SEAL teams that prided themselves on being untouchable. She was an Air Force officer, a rare F-22 Raptor pilot, walking into territory where every glance carried a question. Why are you here? Her boots clicked against the concrete as she adjusted the strap of her flight bag over her shoulder. The hangars stretched ahead, gray giants echoing with the metallic clang of tools and the low hum of engines being tuned. Ground crews moved with purpose, wheeling equipment, shouting orders, and checking aircraft. Conversation stilled for a moment when they noticed her. Eyes flicked toward her flight suit, the Air Force insignia standing out like a challenge. She could feel the scrutiny, heavy and unrelenting. Sarah knew how this looked. A fighter pilot. From the Air Force arriving to instruct Navy and SEAL teams in joint operations? To many, it was an insult. Sarah had spent over a decade carving out her reputation in the unforgiving world of aviation. She was one of fewer than 50 pilots in the world certified to command the F-22 Raptor in combat. Her call sign in the Air Force squadrons had once been ice, a nod to her unnerving calm when chaos reigned in the sky. Missions she had flown in the Middle East were still talked about in flight circles, where her precision strikes had saved units pinned down by enemy fire. Yet here, none of that mattered. Reputation meant little against entrenched pride. She was a guest, an outsider, and worse, a woman in an arena still struggling to reconcile tradition with talent. Ahead, a line of Navy aviators leaned casually against a parked jet, their conversation tapering off as she approached. One of them smirked, nudging his friend. Thought this was a Navy base, not an Air Force recruitment center, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. The others chuckled under their breath. Sarah didn't react. She had endured such remarks her entire career, the kind meant to provoke, to test her composure. She let the words roll off, though her jaw tightened slightly as she passed. Respect couldn't be demanded here. It had to be earned, just as it always had. The base commander's office overlooked the tarmac. From the second-floor window, Admiral Jonathan Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, watching the new arrival. His face was weathered, framed by neatly trimmed silver hair, his uniform crisp, every ribbon a testament to decades of service. Yet, his expression carried no warmth. Reports of Sarah's skill had reached his desk weeks earlier, but to him, skill was not enough. He had spent his career shaping men into warriors, commanding pilots and SEALs who answered without question. Now he was being asked to accept an Air Force officer, handpicked by the Pentagon, to oversee joint training exercises that he believed his men were already masters of. Hargrove didn't like outsiders, and he especially didn't like being told whom to welcome into his command. To him, Sarah Blake represented an intrusion, another example of Washington meddling in things it didn't understand. Her medals and flight hours didn't impress him. In his mind, she had yet to prove herself worthy of setting foot on his base. Sarah entered the briefing room later that morning, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. SEAL team leaders sat at one end, their hardened expressions unreadable. Navy aviators filled the other seats, some whispering quietly, others openly staring at her with skepticism. Admiral Hargrove sat at the head, his hands clasped, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Lieutenant Commander Blake," he said finally, his voice even but clipped. "Welcome to Naval Air Station Coronado. I trust your flight was smooth." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied firmly. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I've read your file. Impressive. F-22s, combat tours, commendations. But let me be clear. This is a Navy installation. We operate differently here. You'll find that our standards are not always the same as yours." Sarah met his gaze evenly, refusing to flinch. "With respect, Admiral, that's why I'm here. Different branches, different methods. The purpose of joint training is to make sure those differences don't cost lives in the field." A murmur rippled through the room. Some SEALs glanced at each other, intrigued by her directness. A few aviators shifted uncomfortably. The Admiral's expression hardened, though he kept his composure. "You'll find my men are already more than capable," Hargrove said slowly. "But since the Department of Defense believes otherwise, you've been given this assignment. Do not mistake that for an invitation to question my authority." The tension was thick enough to cut. Sarah nodded once, refusing to back down, but choosing her words carefully. "Understood, sir. My intention isn't to undermine anyone. My intention is to ensure when your men are in combat, they return home alive." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. The SEAL commander at the far end, a broad-shouldered veteran named Harris, leaned forward slightly. He studied Sarah with a flicker of interest, the kind he reserved only for those who spoke with conviction rather than arrogance. He said nothing, but Sarah caught the subtle shift. Not everyone in the room was against her. Still, as the meeting concluded, Sarah knew she was walking a knife's edge. Every glance, every word carried judgment. She wasn't just here to teach. She was here to prove. To prove she could stand on equal footing with men who prided themselves on being the toughest in the world. To prove that her presence wasn't a political gesture, but a tactical necessity. Later that afternoon, as she walked the flight line, inspecting the aircraft assigned for training exercises, she felt the Admiral's eyes on her again from a distance. He hadn't said much beyond the briefing, but Sarah could sense the storm brewing. He wasn't just skeptical. He was waiting for her to stumble, to give him the excuse he needed to send her packing. Sarah tightened the straps of her flight suit and looked skyward. A jet roared overhead, its thunder shaking the ground beneath her boots. She had faced doubt before, from instructors, peers, even superiors, who believed women didn't belong in cockpits. Each time she had answered the same way, by flying harder, faster, sharper than anyone expected. She didn't come here to win approval. She came here to fly, to train, to fight if needed. And if Admiral Hargrove believed he could intimidate her into silence, he was about to discover just how wrong he was. Asterisk. The following morning began with the sharp buzz of the base intercom, summoning officers and squad leaders to the tactical operations room. Sarah had spent the night reviewing joint mission reports, diagrams, and after-action assessments. She walked into the briefing determined to establish credibility. She wasn't here to play politics. She was here to demonstrate value. Yet as she stepped inside, she could feel the tension coiled like wire. The room was dominated by a long table, scattered with maps and projection screens, showing simulated mission scenarios. Navy aviators lounged in their chairs, whispering among themselves. SEAL leaders sat upright, arms crossed, their faces unreadable. At the head of the table, Admiral Hargrove waited, his presence commanding silence. His gaze followed Sarah as she took her seat near the end of the table, a deliberate placement signaling her outsider status. The Admiral opened the session with his usual authoritative tone. "Gentlemen and Lieutenant Commander Blake," he said, the faintest edge sharpening the words. "Today we'll review air support coordination for upcoming joint operations. The Navy has perfected carrier-based strikes for decades. The SEALs, as you know, rely on precision insertion and extraction. Air Force participation has historically been minimal. His eyes flicked toward Sarah, cold and dismissive. Still, the Pentagon seems to think outside perspectives are necessary. Sarah clasped her hands on the table, biting back a retort. She listened as the Admiral laid out his strategy. A plan relying heavily on conventional air cover at medium altitude, predictable flight patterns, and delayed strike windows. It was textbook Navy doctrine. Effective in theory, but slow. Vulnerable and outdated against modern adversaries equipped with advanced surface-to-air missiles. When he concluded, silence lingered until Sarah spoke. With respect, Admiral, these tactics don't account for current enemy capabilities. In recent conflicts, SAM systems have evolved. Flying at those altitudes would expose aircraft to unnecessary risk. We've already lost assets overseas to similar strategies. The room went still. All eyes turned to her. Some aviators smirked, anticipating fireworks. The SEALs leaned forward slightly. Curious, the Admiral's jaw tightened. Lieutenant. Commander, this is Navy air doctrine. These tactics have worked for decades. You do well to remember you're a guest here. Sarah held her ground. Sir, doctrine doesn't stop missiles. Enemy forces adapt. That's why we train together, to adapt faster than they do. With low altitude, high-speed maneuvers, supported by stealth capabilities, we could strike before detection. The F-22 is designed for exactly that purpose. If we coordinate those maneuvers with SEAL extractions, survivability increases tenfold. A low whistle came from the back of the room. One of the younger SEALs muttered, "She's not wrong." Harris, the SEAL commander, shot him a silencing glance, but his own expression revealed thoughtfulness rather than annoyance. The Admiral's face reddened slightly. "Lieutenant Commander Blake," he said, his voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. "You are not here to rewrite Navy doctrine. You are here to observe, to offer limited input, and to follow orders. Your theories may impress in the Air Force, but this is my command. My men trust my judgment, not yours." Sarah's pulse hammered, but she forced her tone steady. "Sir, with respect, your men's lives may depend on adjusting those tactics. I'm not here to disrespect tradition. I'm here to make sure no SEAL, no pilot, comes home in a body bag because we refuse to adapt." The silence that followed was suffocating. Aviators exchanged uneasy glances. A few SEALs looked down at the table, hiding smirks at her boldness. Admiral Hargrove rose from his chair slowly, deliberately, his height and presence filling the room. "Enough?" he snapped. "Lieutenant Commander Blake, I will not tolerate insubordination or lectures from someone who doesn't belong here in the first place." He pointed toward the door. "Pack your gear. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duties on this base." Gasps echoed in the room. A few aviators grinned, satisfied. Others looked away, uncomfortable. The SEALs remained stone-faced, though Sarah caught Harris's eyes narrowing at the Admiral's words. Sarah stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Humiliation burned like fire beneath her skin, but she refused to let it show. She snapped a crisp salute. "Yes, sir," she said firmly, her voice carrying no tremor. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the room buzzing in her wake. Outside, the California sun was blinding. She strode across the tarmac, every step echoing with the weight of dismissal. A few enlisted men paused to watch, sensing the drama but unsure of details. Sarah kept her head high, though her chest ached with the sting of rejection. She had been undermined before by skeptical instructors, arrogant peers, and stubborn commanders. But being publicly cast aside in front of the SEALs cut deeper. She reached the small quarters assigned to her, gathered her belongings, and packed them neatly into her duffel. Her orders had been clear: leave. Yet as she zipped the bag, her mind refused to accept defeat. She had been dismissed from the base, but not from her mission. She wasn't here for Admiral Hargrove's approval. She was here because the Pentagon believed she was necessary. And she knew they were right. As she walked toward the exit gate, her eyes caught movement nearby. A group of SEALs lingered near the training field, casually pretending to check their gear. Harris stood among them, arms crossed. He gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A gesture that said, "I saw what happened. I'm not writing you off." Sarah returned the nod, subtly before moving on. That evening, she found herself at a civilian airstrip just outside the base, where her F-22 had been temporarily stationed for safety protocols. The jet gleamed under the floodlights, its sleek frame a reminder of who she was and what she was capable of. If the Admiral thought humiliation would break her, he had underestimated her resolve. She ran her hand along the fuselage, whispering quietly to the machine that had carried her through countless battles. "They'll see," she murmured. "One way or another, they'll see." And as the roar of jets echoed faintly from the Navy base behind her, Sarah Blake felt no defeat, only the beginning of a fight she fully intended to win. The civilian airfield outside San Diego was quiet compared to the Navy base she had been thrown out of. A scattering of hangars lined the runway, most filled with small private planes or retired jets that had long since lost their shine. But at the far end, tucked away from the curious eyes of hobbyist pilots and tourists taking helicopter rides over the coast, gleamed a predator unlike anything else in the skies, Sarah Blake's F-22 Raptor. It didn't belong here. The jet was a weapon of war, a marvel of stealth and speed, standing out like a wolf in a kennel of dogs. Yet here it sat, guarded by a small detachment of Air Force mechanics who hadn't abandoned Sarah even when the Navy had. She still had clearance to fly. She still had her orders. And if Admiral Hargrove didn't want her inside his walls, she would make her own battlefield outside them. At dawn, when the horizon blushed with orange light, Sarah was already strapped into the cockpit. Her gloved fingers danced over controls with the ease of muscle memory. The engines roared to life, shaking the ground as heat shimmered across the runway. Civilians nearby shielded their eyes as the Raptor thundered down the strip and launched skyward, vanishing almost instantly into the clouds. Up there, Sarah was untouchable. The sting of humiliation faded with every climb, every roll, every S&AP turn. The sky was honest in a way men were not. It didn't care about her gender, her branch, or her past. The sky asked only one question: "Can you fly?" And she could, better than most alive. Her training routines became legendary among the few who witnessed them. She would dive from impossible altitudes, pull out at stomach-turning angles, and skim the surface of the Pacific so low her jet kicked up spray like a hurricane. She practiced thrust vector maneuvers that twisted the Raptor midder as though it were defying physics. She rehearsed precision strikes using simulations, mapping every possible angle an enemy might attack. Hours passed in the cockpit until she returned drenched in sweat, her muscles aching, but her eyes sharper than ever. At first, the Navy ignored her. Admiral Hargrove believed she would fade quietly into irrelevance. But word spread fast, as it always did. Sailors stationed on the periphery of the base caught glimpses of her flights. Some came to the civilian airstrip after hours, curious to see the Air Force pilot who refused to disappear. Then came the SEALs. They didn't approach her directly. They never asked for explanations or gave compliments. Instead, they watched from a distance, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding their eyes, posture casual, but attention fixed. Sarah noticed them during her third week of exile. A cluster of men in tactical gear, claiming they were off duty, stood on the edge of the airfield, as a raptor screamed overhead. She didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. She knew warriors when she saw them. The pattern repeated day after day. Whenever she flew, they appeared. At first, only a handful. Then more. By the end of the month, entire squads rotated through, standing silently as her jet carved fire across the sky. Sarah never spoke of it, but privately she understood what was happening. The SEALs, men who trusted only proven grit, were testing her. They had seen her humiliation, her dismissal by the Admiral. Most outsiders would have left bitter and broken. But Sarah stayed. She fought back not with words, but with action. And that was the language the SEALs respected most. One evening, after a grueling day of maneuvers, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, helmet tucked under her arm. Her flight suit was damp with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead. As she walked across the tarmac, she noticed Commander Harris standing alone by the fence. Unlike the others, he didn't pretend to be casual. He met her eyes directly. "You don't quit," he said flatly. Sarah stopped, studying him. Words weren't quite praise, but they weren't condemnation either. "Not my style," she answered. Harris gave a short nod, then turned and walked away without another word. It was enough. The next morning, Sarah added a new element to her routine. She began simulating real-time SEAL extraction missions. Using coordinates provided by sympathetic Air Force contacts, she mapped hypothetical hot zones where special operations teams might be pinned down. She designed maneuvers to cover insertion helicopters, created strike patterns that shielded exfil points, and timed her approach so precisely that ground troops could have set their watches by her passes. As SEALs noticed, from their vantage points, they could see she wasn't just flying for herself. She was flying for them. Every roll, every strike pattern was tailored to make their impossible mission survivable. Among themselves, they began to whisper, not derision this time, but something different. Respect. It was Harris who gave her the first hint. During another evening observation, as a raptor banked hard against the sunset, one of his men muttered, "She flies like a ghost." Harris shook his head. "No, she flies like a Valkyrie." The name stuck. Sarah heard it days later when two young SEALs passed by her hangar, not realizing she was within earshot. "Valkyrie's up again," one said. "Man, she makes the raptor look like it's alive." The call sign was never formally assigned. It wasn't written on any paperwork or logged into any Air Force database. But it spread like wildfire through the SEAL teams. They began referring to her not as Blake, not as the Air Force pilot, but as Valkyrie, the warrior spirit of myth who descended into battle to guide the fallen and decide who lived. Sarah didn't acknowledge the name openly, though. She heard it often. She carried it quietly, wearing it not as pride, but as responsibility. Valkyrie wasn't just a title. It was a promise. Late one night, standing beside her jet under the stars, she thought back to Admiral Hargrove's words. His dismissal, his contempt. She almost smiled. He believed he had erased her from his world. Instead, he had pushed her into another, one where the toughest warriors alive were beginning to see her not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The Admiral wanted her gone. The SEALs had begun to claim her. And the sky, as always, belonged to Sarah Blake. Nicknames were currency in the world of special operations. Call signs, monikers, and whispered titles carried weight. They were earned, not given. To be named by the SEALs was to be acknowledged as part of a tribe that trusted few and tested everyone. Sarah Blake hadn't sought a name, but one had found her. It started quietly. After weeks of watching her training flights, a small circle of SEALs began using the word Valkyrie among themselves. It wasn't casual. It wasn't a joke. It was a statement. To them, her flights weren't just rehearsals. They were acts of guardianship, The Raptor's shadow sweeping over their imagined exfil zones felt like the hand of something otherworldly. The first time Sarah heard it, she was walking back from the hangar after a dusk flight. 2 SEALs passed her, helmets tucked under their arms, mud from training caked on their boots. They thought she was out of earshot. One said, "Valkyrie's covering us again tonight." The other nodded as if it were fact. Sarah kept walking, face impassive, but her heart thudded with recognition. They weren't mocking her. They believed. The name spread quickly, whispered in gyms, during live fire drills, on night training ops. At first, she didn't acknowledge it. She still wasn't officially part of their world. Admiral Hargrove's dismissal had stripped her of any formal authority, and he made sure she was excluded from Navy schedules. Yet the SEALs began looping her into their own routines informally. A sergeant would leave a map folded on her hangar table, marked with coordinates. Another would mutter, "Low flyby 0200," as he passed. And when the team assembled for night extractions in training zones, they often looked skyward, expecting the scream of her jet. She always delivered. Sarah began tailoring her flights directly to their movements. If SEALs were simulating an insertion into a coastal target, she flew low over the water, creating cover noise against the helicopter's approach. If they practiced extraction from desert terrain, she swept overhead at the precise moment they broke contact, timing her simulated strikes to shield their retreat. Each maneuver wasn't just flying. It was a conversation, wordless but understood. One night, after a brutal 3-day training cycle, Commander Harris approached her at the airfield. He watched as her mechanics checked the Raptor systems, then stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You know they're calling you." "Valkyrie," he said. Sarah looked up from her checklist. "I've heard," she replied evenly. "It's not a name they hand out lightly," Harris continued. "You've earned it. You should know that." Sarah studied him. "Names don't change reality, Commander. I'm still off the Admiral's base. Still technically an outsider." Harris's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Outsiders don't get saluted by SEAL teams in whispers. Keep flying the way you do, and titles won't matter. With that, he turned and walked away. Sarah sat in the cockpit that night longer than usual, staring at the darkened runway. She hadn't asked for the name, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Valkyries were myth, warriors who chose who lived and who died. The SEALs weren't just admiring her skill. They were beginning to place their faith in her. And that was heavier than any medal she had ever worn. Meanwhile, back on the Navy base, Admiral Hargrove's frustration deepened. He had dismissed her with the expectation that she would vanish quietly, her career reduced to whispers of rebellion. Instead, those whispers had become something else, a tide he couldn't control. Reports reached him that SEALs were spending time at the civilian airfield. He pretended not to notice, but he could feel authority slipping. The respect he commanded through decades of service was being silently redirected to a pilot he had cast aside. During one staff meeting, a junior officer accidentally used the word Valkyrie when discussing close air support scenarios. The Admiral's glare froze the room, his knuckles whitening against the table. "Lieutenant," he said with icy calm, "we do not use fairy tales to describe personnel." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," the officer stammered, but the damage was done. The name had slipped into official air. Sarah, however, didn't revel in his discomfort. She wasn't chasing his downfall. She was too busy chasing perfection. Every day she pushed the Raptor harder, shaving seconds off her response times. Inventing maneuvers even her instructors had once called impossible. Her mechanics joked she was trying to break the jet. Sarah only smiled thinly. She wasn't trying to break it. She was trying to make it part of herself. Her relationship with the SEALs grew in unspoken ways. They began showing up at the hangar. After flights, offering her bottles of water, trading stories about near misses on deployments. They never said it outright, but their presence was acknowledgement enough. She had passed an invisible test. She was no longer being observed. She was being accepted. One night, after a particularly difficult training exercise in the mountains, a young SEAL approached her as she stepped out of her flight suit. He hesitated and said, "Ma'am, I don't know if you realize what it means when you fly over." It's like, he struggled for words. It's like we can breathe again. Like we've got someone up there watching who won't let us die. Sarah froze, taken aback by the raw honesty. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "I can't promise you won't face hell out there," she said quietly. "But I can promise if I'm in the sky, I'll do everything to make sure you come home." The SEAL nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought emotion. "That's why you're Valkyrie," he said simply. Then he walked away. Alone in the hangar that night, Sarah sat against the landing gear of her jet, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the call sign. It wasn't a label of arrogance or superiority. It was a bond, a responsibility, and perhaps, though she didn't dare admit it yet, a destiny. The Admiral had tried to silence her. Instead, he had inadvertently created something larger. She wasn't just Sarah Blake, the dismissed Air Force officer. She was Valkyrie, a name that now echoed through every SEAL briefing, every whispered conversation before a mission, every glance skyward when they needed hope. And though she carried it with humility, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. Legends weren't written in offices. They were written in the sky. The call came just past midnight. Sarah had just finished a 14-hour training cycle and was still peeling off her flight suit when her secure phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent, unmistakably military. "Lieutenant. Commander Blake, stand by. Situation developing overseas. Possible deployment request inbound." Sarah froze. Deployment. She hadn't heard that word in months, not since she'd been pushed off the Navy base and effectively sidelined. "Copy," she said simply, though her pulse quickened. She hung up, heart hammering as she stared across the hangar where her Raptor sat in shadow. The jet seemed to sense the shift, as if it too was bracing for the fight. Hours earlier, halfway around the world, a SEAL team had been ambushed. They were deep in hostile territory, an extraction gone wrong. Intelligence had underestimated the enemy presence, and the SEALs were now surrounded by fighters armed with heavy machine guns, RPGs, and a mobile surface-to-air missile battery. They were pinned, their guns crackling with urgency as they called for air cover. The Navy scrambled jets, but every option came out short. Carrier-based aircraft were too far out, too slow to respond, and vulnerable to the SAM threat. Drones were overhead, but couldn't provide enough firepower to punch a hole for the SEALs. Time was bleeding away. Within hours, maybe minutes, the SEAL team would be overrun. At command headquarters, Admiral Hargrove listened grimly to the situation. Reports. His officers spoke over each other, their voices tight with panic. "Sir, we don't have anyone within range who can fly low enough to suppress those positions without being lit up by radar." Another officer interjected. "Even if we did, it would take surgical precision. Whoever goes in has to thread the needle between terrain and missile lock. That's suicide." Hargrove's jaw clenched. He knew it. Every calculation pointed to the same grim conclusion. No pilot under his command could pull it off. Not with the speed required, not with the margin for error being zero. That was when Commander Harris spoke. His voice cut through the chaos. Like a blade, there's one pilot who can. The room went silent. Every head turned. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He didn't need the name. He already knew. Harris didn't hesitate. Valkyrie. A murmur rippled through the staff. Some bristled at the audacity. Others looked away, unable to deny the truth. Hargrove slammed a fist against the table. "She's not part of this command. She was dismissed." "With respect, sir," Harris shot back, his tone sharper than he'd ever dared with a superior. "Your dismissal doesn't change the fact she's the only one who can do this. We've all seen her fly. You've seen her. You know I'm right." The Admiral's face flushed with anger, but inside something else churned dread. He had worked his entire career to command respect from the SEALs, to be their anchor. Yet now, in their hour of desperation, they weren't looking to him. They were looking to the woman he had thrown out. "Get her on comms," Harris ordered. Before the Admiral could speak again. Moments later, Sarah was patched through. The mission was laid out in clipped detail. Hostile terrain, high-density threats, a team of SEALs trapped with dwindling ammunition. The only viable window for extraction was if air support could punch a corridor through enemy positions and hold it long enough for helicopters to sweep in. "Understood," Sarah said, her voice steady. On the other end of the line, Harris asked bluntly, "Can you do it?" Sarah glanced at her Raptor through the hangar's open bay doors. The jet gleamed under the floodlights, a predator waiting to be unleashed. She didn't hesitate. "I can." She didn't add what they all knew, that the margin for error was razor thin, that one miscalculation would mean not only her death, but the death of every SEAL on the ground. Confidence wasn't bravado. It was necessity. Within the hour, she was suiting up. Her mechanics moved like shadows, prepping the Raptor with fuel and armaments. Missiles slid into place, sensors calibrated, every system checked twice. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of leather and electronics grounding her. As she strapped in, she replayed the Admiral's words from weeks earlier. "You don't belong here." He had dismissed her as if she were irrelevant. Now, she was strapping into the only machine in the world capable of saving his men. The canopy lowered, sealing her inside the cocoon of glass and steel. She flipped switches, the cockpit coming alive with glowing displays. Her voice was calm as she radioed in. "Valkyrie ready for launch." For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then Harris's voice came through, firm and certain. "Godspeed, Valkyrie. Bring our men home." On a different channel, Admiral Hargrove listened. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to reassert authority, but the words caught. He had nothing to offer. Silence was all that remained. The engines roared, shaking the hangar. Sarah eased the Raptor down the runway, heart steady, mind locked into mission focus. As the jet screamed into the sky, the world below seemed to fall away. Ahead lay danger, chaos, the kind of mission that would define not just survival, but legacy. Sarah Blake had been humiliated, cast aside, told she didn't belong. But now, with lives hanging in the balance and an impossible mission resting squarely on her shoulders, one truth echoed louder than the roar of her engines. She was Valkyrie, and Valkyrie did not fail. The Raptor sliced through the night at supersonic speed, a streak of shadow and fire. Sarah's hands gripped the controls with steady precision, her breathing slow, her mind locked into the rhythm of combat preparation. Ahead, the horizon shimmered. With heat and conflict, where a SEAL team crouched in hostile mountains, their fate balanced on her skill. She switched to the encrypted channel. Static filled her headset before a strained voice cut through. "This is Ghost 2. We're pinned. Ammo low. We need cover now." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Valkyrie inbound," she replied, voice calm as stone. There was a pause, then a ripple of disbelief. "Say again?" Another SEAL asked. "You heard her," Commander Harris confirmed from the operations center. "Valkyrie's in the fight." A cheer erupted faintly across the combs, brief, ragged, but fierce. For the trapped men, hope had just been delivered on wings. Sarah dropped altitude, terrain rushing beneath her like a blur of black and silver. Her radar lit up instantly with threats. Enemy anti-air batteries scanning, SAM sights pulsing. Like predators waiting to strike. She weaved the Raptor low, hugging valleys and cliffs, airing the radar locks to keep pace. Her fingers hovered over the weapon's toggles. The first missile launch flared to life below. Her HUD screamed warnings, tones shrieking in her ears. Sarah reacted without thought. She cut thrust, snapped the Raptor sideways, and pulled into a roll so violent it pressed her body against the seat with crushing force. The missile streaked past, missing by meters before exploding against a ridge. "Splash 1 SAM," she reported, even as sweat rolled down her temple. On the ground, the SEALs looked up. A blazing contrail arced across the sky where Valkyries. Jet had danced death itself. "She's insane," one muttered, half in awe, half in relief. "No," their team leader corrected, a grim smile breaking through mud-streaked exhaustion. "She's ours." Sarah pressed deeper, firing precision. Strikes at enemy trucks and artillery nests. Explosions rippled through the valley, the ground quaking with each detonation. Every blast was calculated, a hole punched into the noose, tightening around the SEALs. Her comms crackled. Ghost 2, moving to extraction point, but we're under. "Heavy fire. Can't hold much longer." "Copy," Sarah answered. "I'll clear the path. Stay low, move fast." She throttled up, the Raptor screaming across the battlefield like a thunderclap. Gunfire lanced skyward, tracers clawing at her jet. Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision, flipping from missiles to her cannon. The Raptor's gun tore open a hillside, shredding enemy positions into silence. Helicopters were inbound now, blades beating against the night, but they needed more time. Sarah dove again, deliberately drawing fire, making herself the brightest target in the sky. Enemy missiles launched in salvos, 4 at once, their contrails. Weaving a net of death, she didn't flinch. She pulled the Raptor into a maneuver so sharp that training manuals called it impossible. A cobra roll followed by a dive that snapped her under the missile's arcs. They whistled past harmlessly, detonating behind her in bursts of fire. Her chest burned, her vision narrowed, but her voice stayed level. "Threats neutralized, corridor is open. Get them out." From the ground, the SEALs broke cover, sprinting. Through smoke and chaos toward the extraction zone. Choppers descended, rotors chopping air, dust spiraling around them. The men piled aboard, some dragging wounded, others firing back until the last second. "Ghost team aboard," came the shout over comms. Relief thundered in Sarah's ears, but it wasn't over. Enemy trucks roared down the valley, reinforcements pouring in. If they reached the zone before the helicopters cleared, the SEALs would be cut down. "Not today," Sarah whispered. She pulled the Raptor into a vertical climb, engines howling, then flipped into a dive straight toward the convoy. She unleashed her payload in a storm of precision, missiles streaking, cannon roaring, fire lighting the night. Trucks exploded one after another, the valley becoming an inferno. The helicopters lifted off, silhouettes vanishing into the dark sky. The SEALs were safe. Sarah pulled the Raptor up sharply, heart pounding, lungs heaving. Silence filled her headset except for the sound of her own breath. Then, one by one, voices came through. "Valkyrie, you saved us. You're the reason we're alive. Every man on this bird owes you his life." Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the words wash over her. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply answered, "I was where I needed to be." Back at headquarters, Admiral Hargrove stood rigid as the success reports flooded in. His officers exchanged glances, some daring to whisper, others openly praising Valkyrie. The Admiral said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. Because in that silence, the truth was undeniable. The woman he had cast aside had just done what no one else could. She had brought his men home, and she had done it not as Sarah Blake, the dismissed pilot. She had done it as Valkyrie, the call sign now etched forever in the hearts of every SEAL who had seen death and lived because she was in the sky. The helicopters touched down at the forward operating base just before dawn. Dust swirled in spirals around the rotors, coating the exhausted SEALs as they staggered off the birds. Their faces were streaked with grime, their uniforms shredded. Some cradling wounds hastily bandaged in the chaos of escape. But every man stepped onto the tarmac alive. Alive because of her. Sarah had landed her Raptor 20 minutes earlier, the jet still radiating heat from its punishing maneuvers. Mechanics swarmed over it, whispering in awe as they inspected. Scorched panels and strained hydraulics. She had pushed the aircraft to its very limits, and somehow both she and the machine had endured. Now she stood near the hangar doors, helmet tucked beneath her arm, watching the SEALs disembark. For a moment, she thought about disappearing quietly, slipping into the shadows the way she had for months since her dismissal. Recognition had never been her aim. The mission's success was all that mattered. But the men saw her. One by one, their weary eyes found hers across the haze of dust and light. No words were exchanged. Instead, something unspoken passed between them, a weight heavier than metals, more enduring than official orders. These were men who had stared death in the face and survived only because the scream of her jet had cut through the night. The first SEAL broke formation. Still limping from a shrapnel wound, he crossed the tarmac and stopped in front of her. His shoulders squared, and with deliberate precision, he raised his hand to his brow. A salute, crisp, unshaken, heavy with gratitude. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Before she could respond, another SEAL stepped forward, then another. Within moments, the entire team lined up in front of her, battered and bloodied, yet standing as straight as parade soldiers. Together, in perfect unison, they saluted. The air fell utterly silent. Sarah's throat tightened. This wasn't the formal acknowledgement of a superior officer. This was something far rarer. SEALs didn't hand out salutes to just anyone. They reserved it for those they deemed worthy of standing in their brotherhood. It was their language, their respect, given freely only when it was beyond question. She forced her hand up, returning the salute with crisp precision, though her vision blurred. For once, she allowed herself to feel the emotion surging through her chest. Not pride, but belonging. She had earned their trust, not through orders or rank, but through action, through keeping her word, through flying when no one else could. A murmur rippled down the line, low but clear. One SEAL, his voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire hours earlier, spoke a single word. Valkyrie. The name spread among them, repeated like a chant, until the hangar walls seemed to carry it. Valkyrie. 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 Sarah lowered her salute, her jaw trembling despite the iron control she usually kept. She wanted to tell them she wasn't a myth, wasn't a legend, just a pilot who had done her job. But she knew better. Legends weren't chosen by those who lived them. They were chosen by those who witnessed. Behind the formation, a small group of officers had gathered, among them Admiral Hargrove. He hadn't spoken since the mission ended. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable. He watched as the men he had commanded for decades now bent their respect toward the very pilot he had cast aside. His silence spoke volumes. For once, the Admiral was not the center of the SEAL's loyalty. That center now stood before them, helmet under her arm, sweat still drying on her brow. A woman he had dismissed as unworthy. Sarah met his gaze across the hangar. For a brief instant, their eyes locked. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't demand acknowledgement. She simply held his stare with calm certainty, as if to say, "I didn't need your permission to belong here. I earned it myself." The Admiral's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Commander Harris stepped forward, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He stopped beside Sarah, facing the line of saluting SEALs. His expression was as hard as ever, but his voice carried something new when he spoke. "Men, remember this moment. You salute not just a pilot. You salute the one who made sure you walked back here today. Valkyrie isn't just a call sign anymore. She's part of this brotherhood." The SEALs dropped their salutes in unison, but the respect lingered in their eyes. Some reached out, clapping Sarah's shoulder as they passed, their hands heavy with unspoken gratitude. A few simply nodded, but those nods carried the weight of unbreakable bonds. Sarah stood still, absorbing it all. For years, she had chased perfection in the cockpit, thinking medals and recognition defined success. But here, among warriors who rarely praised anyone, she found the only recognition that mattered. Later, as the hangar emptied and the wounded were carried to medics, Sarah sat alone on a crate beside her jet. The name Valkyrie still echoed faintly in her ears. She thought of the mythology, winged warriors who chose who lived and who died. She had never liked the comparison. But tonight, after bringing an entire team home alive, she finally understood why they had given her the name. It wasn't about power. It was about trust. And she would carry that trust into every sky she flew. In the shadows at the far end of the hangar, Admiral Hargrove lingered, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't approach, didn't speak. Perhaps he couldn't. His silence was his acknowledgement, the only one he could give. For Sarah, it was enough. She no longer needed his words. She had the salute of every SEAL who mattered, and in that moment, she realized something profound. She had come to the base once as Sarah Blake, Air Force pilot, hoping to prove herself. Now she stood as Valkyrie, warrior of the sky, already proven in the eyes that counted most. And there was no silence in the world that could erase that truth. Weeks had passed since the extraction mission. The SEAL team was now fully recovered, their wounds healed, but their memories still vivid. The night they had faced annihilation etched into their minds. Yet every time they recalled the near impossible ordeal, the name that surfaced was the same: Valkyrie. Reports traveled swiftly, carried from field units to headquarters, whispered in mess halls, and circulated quietly among officers who were in awe of what had occurred. The F-22 pilot who had been dismissed, marginalized, and underestimated had flown into a deadly combat zone and returned an entire SEAL team to safety. It was the kind of story that military communities spoke of in hushed reverence, a tale of skill, courage, and uncanny precision that felt almost mythic. At Naval Air Station Coronado, the effect of her actions rippled through every corridor and office. Officers who had once scoffed at the idea of her presence now spoke her name with deference. Junior aviators who had doubted her abilities studied her flight patterns, hoping to glean even a fraction of her expertise. SEAL teams, previously wary of outsiders, recounted every maneuver she had executed, every second she had risked her own life to save theirs. And through it all, Admiral Hargrove remained in his office, observing quietly. He had tried to control the narrative, to maintain the illusion that his authority was unshakable. But it had slipped through his fingers. Every report, every debrief, every whispered mention of Valkyrie was a reminder of his miscalculation. The SEAL's respect, the most unyielding and discerning of approvals, had shifted irrevocably. and he had been powerless to stop it. Hargrove spent hours at his window overlooking the tarmac, watching jets take off and land, thinking about the pilot who had stolen the hearts of his men with nothing more than skill, courage, and relentless dedication. He didn't speak of it publicly. He didn't write memos or summon press briefings. But internally, he acknowledged a bitter truth. Valkyrie's legend would outlast his pride. Meanwhile, Sarah Blake walked through her hangar, her steps measured but unhurried. The Raptor gleamed under the morning sun, engines cooled but still resonating with the echoes of their last mission. Mechanics and support crews greeted her with a mixture of respect and quiet awe. She responded with nods and smiles, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had brought her to this point. She thought of the dismissal, the skepticism, the daily grind of proving herself to men who had no reason to trust an outsider. And now, here she stood, not as Sarah Blake, Air Force pilot, but as Valkyrie, a name that had become more than a call sign, a symbol of survival, precision, and unwavering dedication. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft knock at the hangar door. Commander Harris stepped inside, hands in his pockets, face as stoic as ever. "You've made quite an impression," he said simply. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do it for impression." Harris's eyes softened slightly, a rare expression of emotion crossing his weathered features. "No, you didn't. And that's why it matters. The men know it. The story is spreading, not because of glory, but because of truth." Sarah studied him, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. "They'll remember," she said quietly. "They already do," Harris replied. "Every SEAL who was there, every man who survived, they'll tell the story. For the rest of their lives, you didn't just save them. You earned a place among them." Outside, jets roared overhead, each takeoff a reminder of the relentless demands of service. Sarah watched them for a moment, thinking about how fragile life could be in the skies and on the ground. She had learned over years of training and missions that skill alone wasn't enough. Precision, courage, and timing were everything, and she had executed all three when it mattered most. The Admiral remained a quiet presence on the tarmac. Sarah caught a glimpse of him from across the hangar, watching silently. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. His silence, for once, was louder than any command. It acknowledged what words never could: her undeniable competence, the respect of his men, and the legacy she had carved out with nothing but determination and skill. Later that evening, Sarah returned to the cockpit of her Raptor. She ran her hands over the controls, memories of the night extraction mission flooding her mind. Every switch, every panel, every gauge reminded her of the tension, the precision, and the stakes that had defined the operation. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the familiar scent of electronics and oil, letting the calm settle over her. The hangar was quiet now, empty but for the shadows of those who had come before her and the machines that would carry others into the fight. She allowed herself a small smile. Valkyrie was no longer just a name whispered in the shadows of a training field. She had become a symbol of perseverance, courage, and the quiet power of proving oneself through action. Somewhere in the base, Admiral Hargrove reviewed his notes again, staring at reports of the extraction mission, the success stories, the accounts of the SEAL's admiration. He didn't write a single memo praising her. He didn't publicly acknowledge her feats. But deep inside, the truth weighed on him. The narrative had shifted. The man who had once dismissed her was no longer the center of the story. Valkyrie was, and she deserved it. The days that followed were filled with subtle but unmistakable signs of her growing legend. SEAL teams began requesting her coordination for training exercises, even when she wasn't officially part of their command. Air Force instructors referenced her maneuvers as examples of unmatched precision. Junior officers studied her flight logs, trying to understand how she had achieved what seemed impossible. Even the Pentagon took notice. Briefings were circulated internally, praising the Air Force pilot, whose rapid response and precision strikes saved an entire SEAL team from hostile capture. Her call sign, Valkyrie, was included in the reports. No longer a whisper among SEALs, but a recognized mark of respect throughout the military. Sarah Blake never sought recognition. She had flown because it was her duty, because it was what she was trained to do. But she could not deny the satisfaction, deep and unshakable, that came with seeing her efforts acknowledged in ways she had never imagined. One quiet morning, she walked along the tarmac, looking out at the horizon. Jets streaked across the sky in perfect formation, pilots executing maneuvers she once taught them, or perhaps had inspired through her example. She thought about the journey, the skepticism, the dismissal, the nights spent training at the civilian airfield, the silent observation of the SEALs, and finally, the mission that had cemented her place. For years, she had defined herself by rank, medals, and precision. Now she understood something deeper. Belonging was not given, it was earned. And trust, once earned, created bonds stronger than any order or official acknowledgement. In the hangar, the faint echo of boots signaled someone approaching. A SEAL walked up, saluted, and said simply, "Valkyrie, the men are heading out for another run. You flying?" Sarah smiled softly, a mixture of humility and quiet pride. "Always," she replied. The jet awaited, engines humming faintly, ready to take her into the sky once more. But this time, she carried something heavier than fuel and firepower. She carried the trust of the men she had saved, the respect she had earned, and the unspoken acknowledgement of an admiral who had no choice but to recognize her legacy silently. The sun rose behind the mountains, illuminating the tarmac with a soft golden light. Valkyrie stood before the Raptor, helmet in hand, eyes on the horizon. She had arrived as an outsider, dismissed and doubted. She had proven herself in ways no report could fully capture. And now, she was not just a pilot, not just Sarah Blake. She was a legend. The Admiral remained in the shadows, silent, watching. And in that silence, she knew he had witnessed the truth. The sky belonged to Valkyrie. And for the first time, it felt completely, irreversibly hers.